Chapter 1 Marley's Ghost. Marley was definitely dead at the beginning of the story. The clergyman, clerk, undertaker, and chief mourner signed the record of his burial, and Scrooge also signed it. Scrooge was known to be reliable and could be trusted with anything he wanted to do. Old Marley was completely dead. Be careful. I don't want to claim that I personally know why a doornail is considered particularly dead. I might have thought that a nail used in a coffin is the most lifeless piece of metal in that business. However, the expression "dead as a doornail" is a wise comparison used by our ancestors, and I won't change it or else we will be in trouble as a country. So, please let me repeat with emphasis that Marley was completely dead. Did Scrooge know he was dead? Of course he did. They were partners for many years. Scrooge was the only one in charge of his affairs and was also his friend and only mourner. Even though Scrooge was not very upset by his death, he was still able to conduct business on the day of the funeral and made a good deal. When Marley's funeral is mentioned, it takes me back to where I started. It is certain that Marley had died, and it's important to understand this or the story I'm going to tell won't make sense. If we didn't know for sure that Hamlet's father had died before the play started, it wouldn't be unusual for him to take a walk at night in a windy spot like his own castle walls, just like any other middle-aged man who might want to surprise his son by showing up unexpectedly, like in St. Paul's churchyard. Scrooge never removed Old Marley's name. It remained above the warehouse door for years after. The business was called Scrooge and Marley, and even new people sometimes referred to Scrooge by either name. He didn't mind being called either name, as they both referred to him. Oh! Scrooge was a very stingy person. He was always squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching and coveting. He was hard and sharp like flint, and he never showed any kindness. He was always secretive, self-contained, and preferred to be alone like an oyster. The coldness within him made his features look old, nipped his nose, shriveled his cheek and stiffened his walk. It also made his eyes red and his thin lips blue, and he spoke in a grating voice. There was a frosty rime on his head, eyebrows, and wiry chin. He always had a low temperature, and even in the hottest weather, he kept his office icy cold. He never even warmed it up at Christmas. Scrooge wasn't affected much by hot or cold temperatures. No amount of warmth could make him feel warm, and no cold weather could make him feel chilly. He was even more bitter than the wind that blew, and snow didn't distract him from his purpose. Bad weather didn't know how to affect him. Although heavy rain, snow, hail, and sleet had an advantage over him in one way, they came down handsomely, while Scrooge never did. No one ever stopped Scrooge in the street to greet him with happy expressions and ask how he was doing or when he would visit. Beggars didn't ask him for a little bit of money, children didn't ask him what time it was, and no one ever asked him for directions to a specific location. Even the dogs of blind men seemed to recognize him, and when they saw him approaching, they would pull their owners into doorways and alleys. Then the dogs would wag their tails, as if to say, "No sight is better than an evil and dark master." But did Scrooge care? Actually, that's what he liked. He enjoyed moving through the busy roads of life and keeping away from any human emotions. The people who knew him called this behavior crazy, but Scrooge didn't mind it at all. One Christmas Eve, during wintry and foggy weather, old Scrooge was busy in his counting house. Outside, he could hear people wheezing and trying to keep warm by beating their hands on their chests and stamping their feet. It was only 3 o'clock, but it was already dark, and the neighboring offices' windows had candles lit, making the brown air look reddish. The fog was so thick that it poured into every crack and keyhole, and the opposite houses looked like ghosts in the narrow street. It seemed as if nature was nearby, making something big and murky with the thick fog. Scrooge's counting-house door was open so he could keep an eye on his clerk. The clerk was in a small and gloomy room, copying letters. Scrooge had a small fire, but the clerk's fire was even smaller, like it had only one coal. However, the clerk couldn't add more coal because Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room. Every time the clerk came in with the shovel, Scrooge predicted that they would have to part ways. So, the clerk put on his white scarf and tried to warm himself with the candle. But he failed because he wasn't a man with a strong imagination. "Merry Christmas, Uncle." "May God bless you," said a happy voice. It was Scrooge's nephew who came to him so fast that he didn't notice him coming. "Bah," said Scrooge. "Humbug." The nephew of Scrooge had been walking quickly in the fog and frost, which made him feel very warm. His face looked red and attractive, his eyes were shining, and his breath made steam. "Christmas is a lie, Uncle," said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't really believe that, do you?" "I do," Scrooge said. "Happy Christmas." "Why are you happy? Why do you have a reason to be happy? You don't have much money." "Come on," said the nephew happily. "Why should you be sad? Why should you be grumpy? You have enough money." Scrooge didn't have a better answer at that moment, so he just said, "Bah," and then added, "Humbug." "Ignore your anger, Uncle," said the nephew. "Happy Christmas, Uncle." "God bless you," said a happy voice. The uncle replied, "What else can I be when I live in a world full of fools like this? Merry Christmas." "I don't care about Merry Christmas. What does Christmas mean to you other than a time to pay bills without money, to realize you are a year older but not a bit richer, and to balance your books and see every item presented against you for a whole year?" "If I could do what I wanted," Scrooge said angrily, "every stupid person who says, 'Merry Christmas' should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a holly stick through his heart. That's what should happen." "Uncle," pleaded the nephew. "Hey, nephew," said the uncle in a serious tone, "you celebrate Christmas your way, and let me celebrate it my way." "Keep it," said Scrooge's nephew again. "But you don't usually keep things." Scrooge said, "I'll leave it alone then. I hope it benefits you." "It has never benefited you before." The nephew said, "There are many things that could have been good for me, but I didn't benefit from them. Christmas is one of those things. However, I've always thought of Christmas as a good time. It's a time when people are kind, forgiving, and charitable. It's the only time of year when people seem to open their hearts and think of others as fellow human beings, instead of seeing them as different. Even though Christmas has never given me money, I believe it has helped me and will continue to do so. So, Uncle, I say, God bless Christmas." The person who was taking care of the tank clapped without meaning to. As soon as they realized it wasn't appropriate, they quickly put out the fire and made sure it wouldn't start again. Scrooge said, "If I hear another noise from you, you will lose your job and won't have a Merry Christmas." "You speak very well," he said to his nephew. "I'm surprised you're not in Parliament. Don't be mad, Uncle. Come and have dinner with us tomorrow." Scrooge said he would meet him. And he really did. He said he would meet him first in that situation. "Why?" exclaimed Scrooge's nephew. Scrooge asked, "Why did you get married?" "Because I fell in love." Scrooge said angrily, "You fell in love? As if that is the most ridiculous thing in the world, even more ridiculous than a happy Christmas." Then he abruptly changed the subject and greeted the other person with a simple, "Good afternoon." "No, Uncle, you never visited me before that happened. Why are you using that as an excuse for not coming now?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I don't want anything from you. I don't ask for anything from you. Can't we just be friends?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I'm very sorry to see that you are so determined. We have never argued before. However, I wanted to try to celebrate Christmas, and I will continue to be in a happy Christmas mood until the end. So, Merry Christmas, Uncle." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "And a Happy New Year." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. His nephew left the room without getting angry, even though he stopped at the door outside to say hello to the clerk, who was colder than Scrooge but still friendly enough to return the greeting. "I heard someone else," whispered Scrooge. "It's my clerk. He only earns 15 shillings a week, and he has a wife and children. He's talking about having a happy Christmas. He must be crazy." This crazy person who let Scrooge's nephew leave had allowed 2 other people to enter. They were chubby men, who looked nice and were now standing in Scrooge's office with their hats off. They held books and papers in their hands and greeted him by bowing. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the men, looking at his list. "Am I speaking to Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley passed away 7 years ago," said Scrooge. "It was on this exact night. I am sure that his surviving partner represents his generosity very well," said the man, showing his identification. It was definitely true because they were 2 people who understood each other well. When the word liberality was mentioned, Scrooge became unhappy, shook his head, and gave the documents back. The man picked up a pen and said to Mr. Scrooge, "During this special time of year, it's especially important that we do something small to help the poor and needy who are suffering a lot right now. There are many thousands of people who don't even have basic necessities, and hundreds of thousands who don't have basic comforts." "Are there no prisons?" asked Scrooge. The man put down the pen and said, "There are many prisons." Scrooge asked, "Are the union workhouses still working?" The man said, "They are still. However, I would like to say that they are not." Scrooge asked, "Are the treadmill and the poor law still active?" "Both very busy, sir." "Oh no. I was scared when you first started talking that something had happened to stop them from doing their job," Scrooge said. "I'm really happy to hear that everything's okay now." The man replied, "We are trying to collect money to buy food, drinks, and warm clothing for the poor. We believe that they don't have enough to be happy and healthy. We are doing this now because it's a time when some people have a lot and others have very little. Can I add your name to our list of donors?" "Nothing." Scrooge replied. "You wish to be anonymous?" "I want to be alone," Scrooge said. "That's my answer if you're asking. I don't enjoy Christmas and I don't have the money to make others happy. I already support the institutions I mentioned, which are expensive, so those who are struggling can go there. A lot of people cannot go there, and many would prefer to die." Scrooge said, "If they prefer to die, they should do so to reduce the population. However, I'm not entirely sure about that." "But you may already know it," said the man. "I'm not involved," said Scrooge. "It's important for a person to focus on their own affairs and not meddle in others. I have enough to keep me occupied. Have a good afternoon, gentlemen." The men realized it was pointless to keep arguing, so they left. Scrooge went back to working, feeling better about himself and in a more playful mood than usual. As the fog and darkness grew thicker, people started running around with lit torches, offering to guide carriages and horses on their way. The old church tower, whose bell would always peek down at Scrooge from a Gothic window in the wall, disappeared from view. The bell still struck the hours and quarters, but its vibrations trembled through the clouds as if it were shivering in the cold. The temperature dropped sharply. In the main street, a group of ragged men and boys gathered around a large brazier, which some laborers were using to repair gas pipes. They warmed their hands and faces in front of the fire, looking content. The water tap, left alone, suddenly froze and turned into icy misanthropy. The lights of the shops, where holly sprigs and berries crackled in the warmth, made people's faces glow red as they passed by. The trades of poulterers and grocers became a splendid joke, a glorious pageant, making it almost impossible to believe that such mundane principles as bargain and sale had anything to do with it. The Lord Mayor, in the mighty mansion house, ordered his 50 cooks and butlers to celebrate Christmas the way a Lord Mayor's household should. Even the little tailor, whom he had fined 5 shillings on the previous Monday for being drunk and violent in the streets, was making tomorrow's pudding in his attic, while his thin wife and baby went out to buy beef. It's getting even foggier and colder. The cold is sharp, penetrating, and biting. If only St. Dunstan had used this kind of weather to give the evil spirit a run for his money instead of relying on his usual weapons, he would have made him howl with pleasure. A young person, whose nose was already being eaten away by the cold like a dog gnawing on bones, leaned down at Scrooge's keyhole to sing him a Christmas carol. However, as soon as the first notes were heard, Scrooge stopped him. "May God bless you, happy sir, and may nothing make you worried or upset." Scrooge grabbed the ruler so forcefully that the person singing ran away in fear. They left the keyhole to the fog and even more pleasant frost. Finally, it was time to close the office. Scrooge didn't want to leave and got off his chair reluctantly. He didn't say anything to the clerk who was waiting to leave, and the clerk understood. He blew out his candle and put on his hat. Scrooge asked, "Do you need all day tomorrow?" "If quite convenient, sir." Scrooge said, "It's not easy, and it's not right. If I were to deduct 2 shillings and 6pence from your pay, you would feel unfairly treated, wouldn't you?" The clerk smiled faintly. "I still pay a full day's wages even if there's no work to be done," said Scrooge. "Don't you think that's fair?" The worker noticed that it happened only once every year. Scrooge said, "Stealing from someone's pocket on December 25th is a terrible excuse. But I guess you'll take the whole day off. Make sure you come earlier the next morning." As he said this, he buttoned his coat up to his chin. The worker said he would do it, and Scrooge left with an angry noise. The office closed quickly, and the worker, who didn't have a coat, wore a long white scarf that hung down to his waist. He went down a slide on Cornhill, with a group of boys, 20 times to celebrate Christmas Eve. Then he hurried home to Camden Town to play blindman's buff. Scrooge had his sad dinner at his usual sad pub. After reading all the newspapers and spending the rest of the evening with his bank book, he went to bed. He lived in rooms that used to belong to his deceased partner. They were a dark set of rooms in a tall building in a courtyard where it seemed out of place. It was so old and sad that only Scrooge lived there, while the other rooms were rented out as offices. The yard was so dark that even though Scrooge knew it well, he had to feel his way around. The fog and frost were so thick around the old black gate of the house that it looked like the spirit of the weather was sitting on the doorstep, sad and thoughtful. The door knocker was very large, but otherwise unremarkable. Scrooge had seen it every day and night while living there, but he was not a fanciful person. He had not thought about his deceased partner Marley since mentioning him that afternoon. However, as Scrooge was about to enter his house and put his key in the lock, he suddenly saw Marley's face in the knocker, without any explanation for how this could have happened. Marley's face was visible in the yard, unlike the other objects which were in the dark. However, it had a gloomy light around it, similar to a bad lobster in a cellar. The face did not appear angry or violent, but looked at Scrooge the way Marley used to, with ghostly spectacles on its forehead. The hair was moving strangely, as if being blown by hot air. The eyes were open, yet completely still. The face had a terrible, pale color, which made it look horrifying. However, the horror seemed to be beyond the face's control and not a part of its own expression. Scrooge was staring at something when he heard a knocking sound again. It was the knocker. He was scared when he entered the room. He felt a terrible sensation that he had never felt before. However, he grabbed the key, opened the door confidently, and went inside. Then, he lit a candle. He hesitated for a moment before closing the door and checked behind it carefully, as if he was afraid of seeing Marley's pigtail sticking out into the hall. However, there was nothing there except for the screws and nuts holding the knocker. He then said, "Oh well," and closed the door loudly. The noise echoed loudly in the house, sounding like thunder. It seemed as though each room upstairs and every barrel in the wine merchant's cellar downstairs had its own echoes. Scrooge was not afraid of echoes. He locked the door and walked slowly across the hallway and up the stairs, trimming his candle as he went. You can talk about driving a big carriage up some stairs or through a law, but what I'm saying is that you could have brought a funeral carriage up those stairs too, and you could have done it easily. The stairs were wide enough and there was enough space. Maybe that's why Scrooge thought he saw a train carriage moving in front of him in the dark. The area wasn't well lit, so it was quite dark with the small light that Scrooge had. Scrooge went up without caring at all. Darkness was inexpensive and he enjoyed it. However, before he closed his heavy door, he checked his rooms to make sure everything was in order. He remembered the face just enough to want to do that. The rooms are all set up correctly. There's a sitting room, a bedroom, and a lumber room. There's no one hiding under the table or sofa. There's a small fire in the fireplace, and a spoon and basin are ready. There's also a little pot of gruel on the stove, because Scrooge has a cold. No one is hiding under the bed or in the closet, and Scrooge's dressing gown is hanging suspiciously on the wall. The lumber room is the same as usual with old items like a fireguard, shoes, fish baskets, a washing stand with 3 legs, and a poker. He was very happy and closed his door, and locked it twice, which was unusual for him. He did this to make sure no one would come in unexpectedly. Then, he took off his tie, put on his comfortable clothes, including his nightcap, and sat in front of the fire to eat his gruel. The fire was very small and not enough to warm him on such a cold night. He had to sit close to the fire and concentrate on it before feeling any warmth from the few pieces of fuel. The fireplace was old, built by a Dutch merchant a long time ago, and decorated with unique Dutch tiles that told stories from the Bible. The tiles depicted various figures such as Cain, Abel, Pharaoh's daughters, the Queen of Sheba, angels descending from the clouds, Abraham, Belshazzar, and apostles sailing in butter boats. There were many images to capture his thoughts, but the face of Marley, who had been dead for 7 years, dominated his mind. If each tile had been blank at first and had the power to reflect his thoughts, there would have been a copy of Marley's head on each tile. Scrooge said, "Humbug," and then walked to the other side of the room. After taking a few turns, he sat down again. He leaned back in his chair and looked around the room. His eyes landed on a bell that was hanging in the room. It was an old, unused bell that was connected to a room on the highest floor of the building. He was surprised and felt a strange fear when he saw the bell start to move. At first, it moved slowly and quietly, but then it started to ring loudly. Soon, every bell in the house was ringing loudly too. This could have lasted for about 30 seconds or a minute, but it felt like an hour. The bells stopped ringing at the same time they had started. After that, there was a clanging sound that came from deep below, as if someone was pulling a heavy chain over the barrels in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge suddenly remembered that ghosts in haunted houses were often described as dragging chains. The door to the basement opened suddenly with a loud noise. He heard the noise get even louder as it moved down to the lower floors, up the stairs, and straight towards his door. Scrooge said, "It's nonsense. I won't believe it." He became scared when the heavy door opened and someone entered the room without stopping. As soon as this happened, the almost out flame of the fire rose for a moment, as if it recognized the person who had just entered as Marley's ghost, and then went back down. The person's face was exactly the same as before. Marley wore his hair in a pigtail, his usual waistcoat, tights, and boots. The tassels on his boots stood up like his pigtail, and his coat and hair were also messy. He wore a chain around his waist that was long and wrapped around him like a tail. Scrooge looked at it closely and saw that it was made of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses made of steel. Marley's body was see-through, so when Scrooge looked at him, he could see the 2 buttons on the back of his coat through his waistcoat. Scrooge had heard people say that Marley didn't have any feelings, but he didn't believe it until now. No, he didn't believe it even now. He looked at the ghost carefully and saw it in front of him. He felt cold when he looked into its eyes, and he noticed the cloth around its head and chin that he hadn't seen before. However, he still didn't believe it and tried to ignore what his senses were telling him. "What do you want from me?" said Scrooge, in a sharp and unfriendly tone. "Much." It's Marley's voice, no doubt. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." Scrooge asked, "Who were you before?" He spoke louder than before. "You're picky for a ghost." He was going to say, "to a ghost," but he changed his words because it sounded better. "I was your partner in life, Jacob Marley." "Can you please sit down?" asked Scrooge, while looking uncertainly at the person. "I can." "Do it, then." Scrooge asked a question because he didn't know if a see-through ghost could sit in a chair. He was worried that if the ghost couldn't sit, he would have to explain why. However, the ghost sat down on the other side of the fireplace like it was normal for him to do so. The ghost said, "You don't trust me." "I don't," said Scrooge. "How can you prove that I exist besides what you can see, hear, touch, or feel with your own body?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" Scrooge said, "They are affected by small things. A small stomach problem can make them cheat. You might be a piece of beef that wasn't digested well, a spot of mustard, a tiny piece of cheese, or an undercooked potato bit. You seem more like a sauce than a ghost, no matter what you are." Scrooge wasn't someone who made jokes very often, and he didn't feel like being funny at that moment. The truth is that he tried to act clever to take his mind off things and stop himself from feeling terrified. The ghost's voice was making him extremely frightened. Scrooge thought that if he sat there silently staring at the ghost's fixed, glazed eyes for a moment longer, it would drive him crazy. It was also terrifying that the ghost seemed to have its own hellish atmosphere around it. Scrooge couldn't feel it himself, but he could see that the ghost's hair, skirts, and tassels were still moving as if they were in the hot steam from an oven, even though the ghost was sitting perfectly still. "Do you see this toothpick?" asked Scrooge, quickly changing the subject because of the reason just mentioned. He wished, even if it was just for a moment, to take the attention away from himself from the unresponsive vision. "I do," replied the ghost. Scrooge said, "You're not looking at it." "I still see it," said the ghost, "even though." Scrooge said, "Well, I just need to swallow this and then I'll be bothered by many goblins that I made up for the rest of my life. It's nonsense, I tell you, nonsense." The ghost made a scary sound and shook its chain very loudly. Scrooge was so scared that he held onto his chair tightly so he wouldn't faint. But he became even more afraid when the ghost removed the bandage from its head, as if it was too hot to wear inside, and its bottom jaw fell down onto its chest. Scrooge knelt down and put his hands together in front of his face. "Oh no," he said. "Scary ghost, why are you bothering me?" "Do you believe in me or not?" asked the ghost. "You seem like someone who is focused on worldly matters." Scrooge said, "I agree, I will do it. But I wonder, why do ghosts exist and why do they visit me?" Scrooge felt that if he sat silently staring at the fixed glazed eyes for a moment, it would greatly disturb him. The ghost said that every man needs to go out and meet other people and explore the world around him. If he doesn't do this while he is alive, then he will have to do it after he dies. He will be forced to wander through the world and see things that he can't be a part of, even though he could have enjoyed them when he was alive. Once more, the ghost shouted loudly, shook its chains, and twisted its shadowy hands. Scrooge trembled as he said, "You are restrained. Can you tell me why?" "I have this chain on me that I made during my lifetime," said the ghost. "I created it bit by bit, and I put it on myself willingly, and I wore it willingly. Do you find the design of the chain unusual?" Scrooge trembled more and more. "Would you like to know," said the ghost, "how heavy and long is the strong chain that you carry?" "It was just as heavy and long as this one, 7 Christmases ago. You have been working on it ever since then. It is a very heavy chain." Scrooge looked around on the floor, hoping to find a lot of iron cable, but he couldn't see anything. "Jacob," he begged. "Please, tell me more about old Jacob Marley. Say something to make me feel better, Jacob." "I don't have any to give," said the ghost. It comes from different places, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is given to different types of people by other spirits. I also can't tell you what I want to say. I'm only allowed to say a little bit more. I can't rest, stay, or linger anywhere. My spirit never went outside our office, remember that. When I was alive, my spirit never left the small space where we exchanged money. I have many tiring journeys ahead of me. Scrooge had a habit of putting his hands in his pockets when he thought about something. He did this again while thinking about what the ghost had told him. He didn't look up or stand up from his kneeling position. "You were very slow, Jacob," Scrooge said politely, showing respect and humility in a professional way. "Slow," the ghost repeated. Scrooge thought to himself, it's been 7 years since he died. And he's been traveling this whole time? The ghost said that it felt tormented by guilt all the time, without any rest or peace. "You travel fast," said Scrooge. The ghost said, "On the wings of the wind." Scrooge said, "You may have covered a lot of distance in 7 years. The ghost heard this and made another loud cry. It also made a loud noise by rattling its chains in the quiet of the night. It was so loud that someone could have complained about it being a disturbance. The ghost cried out, "Oh no! You are a prisoner, bound and chained. You do not understand that it will take endless work from immortal creatures, over countless ages, to fully develop the good that this world is capable of. You do not know that any Christian spirit, working kindly within its own small sphere, will find that its mortal life is too short for the great good it can achieve. You do not realize that no amount of regret can make up for wasted opportunities in life. And yet, that is what happened to me. Oh, that is what happened to me." Scrooge hesitated and said, "Jacob, you were always good at doing business." He started to think about how this applied to himself. The ghost cried out, "Business," and wrung its hands again. "My business was humanity. I cared about the well-being of everyone, and things like kindness, mercy, patience, and generosity were all part of my business. The transactions I made were only a small part of my overall business, which was vast like an ocean." The creature lifted its chain with one arm and held it away from its body, as if that was the reason for its sorrow. Then it dropped the chain heavily onto the ground once more. "At this time of year," the ghost said, "I suffer the most. Why did I walk through groups of people with my eyes always looking down and never looking up at the star that guided the wise men to a Were there no poor homes that its light could have shown me?" Scrooge felt very worried when he heard the ghost speaking in this way, and he started to shake a lot. "I'm speaking to you," shouted the ghost. "I don't have much time left." "I will do it," said Scrooge. "But please don't be too harsh on me. Don't use complicated language, Jacob. Please. I can't explain how I'm now visible to you, but I've been sitting next to you for many days without you noticing me." Scrooge didn't like the idea. He felt cold and wiped the sweat from his forehead. The ghost continued speaking and said, "This is a serious part of my punishment. I'm here tonight to tell you that you still have a chance to avoid ending up like me. I can help you get that chance, Ebenezer." Scrooge said, "You were always a good friend to me." And the other person replied, "Thank you. The ghost will come back and you will be visited by 3 spirits," said the ghost. Scrooge's face fell almost as much as the ghost's had. "Jacob, is that the opportunity and optimism you talked about?" he asked, his voice wavering. "It is." Scrooge said, "I think I'd rather not." The ghost said, "If they don't visit you, you won't be able to avoid the same fate as me. Expect the first visit tomorrow when the bell rings at 1. "Can I take all of them together and finish it quickly, Jacob?" suggested Scrooge. "Wait for the second one tomorrow night at the same time. The third one will come the following night after 12 o'clock. Don't expect to see me again, and please remember what we talked about for your own benefit." After saying those words, the ghost picked up its cloth from the table and wrapped it around its head like earlier. Scrooge knew this because of the sharp sound its teeth made when the bandage brought its jaws together. He dared to look up again and saw that his otherworldly guest was standing tall with its chain wrapped around its arm. The ghost moved away from Scrooge and the window opened more with each step it took. When it got to the window, it gestured for Scrooge to come closer. He did, but when they were only 2 steps apart, the ghost held up its hand and signaled for Scrooge to stop. The person didn't obey but was surprised and scared when they raised their hand and heard strange, sad sounds in the air. The sounds were like people crying and feeling sorry for themselves. The ghost also heard the sounds and started singing a sad song before disappearing into the cold, dark night. Scrooge went to the window, feeling very curious. He looked outside. The air was full of ghosts who wandered around in a hurry and moaned as they moved. All of them were wearing chains like Marley's ghost. Some of them, who might have been guilty governments, were chained together. None of them were free. Scrooge knew many of them personally during their lives. He was familiar with one old ghost in a white waistcoat, who had a huge iron safe attached to his ankle. The ghost cried sadly because it couldn't help a poor woman with a baby that it saw below on a doorstep. The problem with all the ghosts was that they wanted to interfere in human affairs for good but had lost that power forever. He wasn't sure if these creatures disappeared into the mist or if the mist covered them. However, both the creatures and their ghostly voices disappeared at the same time, and the night returned to how it was when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window and checked the door where the ghost had come in. He had locked it with his own hands and the bolts were untouched. He wanted to say, "Humbug," but he couldn't finish the word. He was tired from the emotions he had felt, or from the activities of the day, or from seeing the invisible world, or from the dull conversation with the ghost, or from how late it was. He needed to rest, so he went to bed without changing his clothes and fell asleep right away.